other day, she said to me, "Grandmother, I think."
Picture with you.
Of course. Well, glad to.
70s, but
Yeah. Yeah, but I thought your experience was neat.
Thank you so much for coming. I'm Sharon Kelly Roth with the bookstore, and it's a delight to see you. We do a lot of events here at Books and Company, and I think this is our very favorite one. Each year we look forward to it. So thank you for being part of it. And we want to acknowledge Sharon Rabb, who's the chair, co-chair of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Sharon, and raise your hand. She's a remarkable woman. And next to her is Mark Meister, who's the other co-chair. And we have a special guest today from our home office at Books A Million down in Alabama, and that's Roger Reither. Rachel Vice President, happy he made the trip to go out. I know you're anxious to start, but first I want to thank Panera Bread too for providing the coffee and tea and the pastries. Now I'll turn the program over to Shannon Simms. She's with Fox 45, ABC 22, and she'll start the program for us.
Good morning, everyone. It is so good to see all you up so early in the morning. For me, this is a little bit early. I work the evening shift from 6 to midnight, so this is an early one for me, but it is great to see all of you out here. I'm going to try to see if I can put this in the podium. I'm not used to always holding a mic, used to one kind of clip to me. But I do want to welcome you guys. Oh, may have turned it off.
Turned off the switch.
I'll hold the mic. I do want to welcome you guys to this conversation this morning with our 2012 Dayton Literary Peace Prize winners. Now, I just kind of want to give you an example of how we'll be doing this. I'll give you a background of each one of our authors today, and after doing so, they will talk a little bit about themselves and the books that were chosen this year, and then I will turn it over to Christopher Cerf, who will then have a Q&A conversation where you can kind of have more of an intimate conversation with the authors. Does that sound good?
Great.
Awesome, awesome. Well, let's first mention a number of the prominent writers who came and made this possible that these writers could be chosen today. That panel consisted of Ken McLean, Christopher Cerf, Alan Chews, and April Smith. They were instrumental in choosing the winners that you see in front of us this morning. Rather, again, I have to wake up, so please excuse me. I would now like to let you know that, again, all the books that you see here can be signed by the authors, I believe, and can be purchased today, so we hope that you will do that after the conversation. But I'd like to ask that Sharon would come forth, and she would like to welcome you first, and then I'll go a little bit more into the background of each author.
Thank you, Shannon, and thanks for being with us this morning. That is good of you to get up so early. And I'd like to thank Sharon Kelly Roth and all the people at Books & Co., and especially our guest from afar, and say thank you for allowing us to come into such a wonderful bookstore and spend the morning with these authors. I've had the opportunity to at least email these people many, many times, and they are absolutely charming. You'll have such a good morning with them. I'd also like to thank you for coming. It takes the support of Dayton for all of this to happen, and you are part of that support, and we totally appreciate your being here this morning. So I know you want to hear the authors, not me, and so welcome, and let's get started.
Thank you, Sharon. All right. Well, our first author won our fiction prize, and that is Andrew Krivak. Did I say it correctly? That's correct. Awesome. Andrew is the author of the novel The Sojourn, a National Book Award finalist and winner of the Chautauqua Prize. The grandson of Slavic immigrants, Krivak grew up in Pennsylvania. He has lived in London, but now he is living with his wife and children in Massachusetts, where he is teaching in the Arts and Science Honor Program at Boston College. Our fiction runner-up is Ha Zhen. Now, Ha Zhen wrote Najing Requiem. Now, he was not able to make it today, but he did send this quote, and I'd like to read it for him in regards to peace. It says, quote, "Words alone might not produce peace, but a literary work ought to celebrate the goodness of humanity while describing the destruction and losses due to its absence. We write not only to tell a story, but also to reduce the violence within ourselves and others. A book has no greater role than to serve the purpose of promoting peace. And I just thought that was awesome. I mean, it just kind of sums up what this whole organization and this whole event is about, trying to get us to be better about ourselves and to hopefully promote peace within and with others. I then would like to introduce you to our nonfiction winner, which is Adam Hochschild. And his book that won was To End All Wars. He was born in New York City in 1942. His first book, Half the Way Home, a memoir of father and son, was published in 1986. For the body of his work, he has received the Lannan Literary Award, the Theodore Roosevelt Woodrow Wilson Award of the American Historical Association, and a 2012 Arts and Letters Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His books have been translated into 14 languages. Now, our nonfiction runner-up is Anya Zuladlo. I was trying hard. I was hoping to get it. Zuladlo. Did I get it correct, Anya? Susadlo. Who was born in Chicago. Anya grew up in Bloomington, Indiana. She received her master's in journalism from New York University in 2000. And in late 2003, she decided to leave New York behind and go to Baghdad. And after going to Baghdad, she worked as a stringer for the Christian Science Monitor. She wrote a number of pieces while there, some that I'd like to just mention: Military Islamist Poetry Slams, The Flight of the Country's Christian Minority, and Iraq's first reality TV show. I want to know more about that one. She now lives somewhere between New York and Beirut with her husband and journalist Mohad Bazi. And then rounding out our panel of authors, I am pleased to introduce the 2012 Richard C. Holbrooke Distinguished Achievement Award winner, Tim O'Brien. Now, Tim received the National Book Award in Fiction in 1979 for his novel, Going After Cicciato. Did I say it correct?
Pretty close.
Okay. In 2005, The Things They Carry was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. In 2010, O'Brien received the Catherine Ann Porter Award. His novels have been sold more than 3 million copies, and he's been translated in more than 20 languages. We have a very distinguished group of authors here today, and I hope that you have questions for them all. I will now ask that Mr. Christopher Cerf, who is not only an author, he is an editor, a composer, a lyricist, a recorder, and television producer, and co-founder and president of the educational media production company Serious Thinking Ltd. Cerf is won 3 Emmys and 2 Grammy Awards for his musical contributions to Sesame Street. That alone right there, you won me over. And I'm sure you'll have a new one for Big Bird. Cerf's newest book, co-authored by Henry Beard, is Encyclopedia Paranoia: Everything You Should Be Afraid of or Worried About. Now, that will be published in November, and this, it is end of November. So now you can
November
get,
20th, if the world doesn't end first.
okay. Oh, yes. And Wilbert Rideau, who's on the end. Could you please raise your hand? Wilbert is also joining us today. So I would ask that Christopher Cerf would come up and join me for a little Q&A.
You gonna do the Q&A before they speak? Yeah.
Well, you can come up here and join me. I'm feeling a little lonely.
Okay, well, thank you.
So we don't necessarily have to go in order. We can start with whoever has the mic, which it seems like Andrew, you have it.
Okay. Shall I use your mic to ask questions?
Well, we're gonna let Andrew.
Oh, you're gonna let them speak?
Yes, you helped me to figure out where we were going in the program here.
Oh, okay.
So we're gonna ask that each one of the authors give us a little background of themselves and their book, and then Christopher and I will just stand here, and then we'll Q&A, right?
Good. Sounds good to me.
Okay.
So you wanna start with Adam?
Background on myself in a book. Now, you want the 5-minute version, the 10-minute version, the hour long
Cliff
version?
Note version.
Okay, Cliff Note version. Background on myself is that I have been writing in one way or another all of my life. I started off writing for daily newspapers, then graduated to magazines, then graduated to books, and I'm not quite sure what the next step is. Encyclopedias, maybe. The books seem to be getting longer and longer and longer. I love writing because it allows me to jump into other people's lives, and especially other people's lives in other places and times. One of the great things about writing for me is that you get to travel both in time and geographically. As you know, fiction writers, of course, do this as well. Non-fiction writers actually have to go there when you do it geographically, which makes for a lot of fun travel. And we have to work hard when we travel in time to try to reconstruct the world that we're traveling into in as accurate a way as possible, because we're not allowed to make anything up. I find myself most attracted to writing about times and places where people seem to face a huge moral and political question. My last book before this one, for example, was about the British anti-slavery movement, where in the 1780s there suddenly arose a remarkable group of people in London who began to question the institution of slavery, which was something that was pretty much taken for granted almost everywhere on earth at that point in time. I'm attracted to moments like that. The First World War, which my last book is about, To End All Wars, has always intrigued me because it was a spasm of such totally senseless carnage. It broke out when the major nations of Europe were actually getting along with each other rather well. The royal families of Europe, who had a great deal more power at that time than they do today, were all interconnected. Everybody was a cousin of somebody else. They went on holidays on each other's yachts. Germany was Britain's biggest trading partner. And in the space of about 6 weeks, through a very odd chain of events, starting with the assassination of the Austrian Archduke at Sarajevo in the summer of 1914, in that one summer, Europe, totally went up in flames. And the flames kept burning for 4.5 years. It was a war that remade the world for the worse in every conceivable way, left more than 9 million dead soldiers behind it, far larger number wounded, millions upon millions of civilian deaths as well. We'll never know the exact number. And of course it laid the groundwork for an even more terrible war to come. So my fascination with that period comes from wondering how this outrageous spasm of carnage could break out so quickly. Who were the people who orchestrated it? Who were the generals who ran these armies? And who were in all of the countries involved? But for storytelling purposes, I ended up focusing on one, Great Britain. Who were the people who were courageous enough to see this as madness and to refuse to fight? Or, if they were beyond military age, to support those who refused to fight. So essentially, this book of mine is trying to retell the story of this war not as a conflict between two sides, but as a conflict between people who thought it was a noble and necessary crusade and people who thought it was absolute madness and who acted on their convictions. And I tried to do so by assembling a cast of characters of both those types of people with many connections to each other. I could go on and on, but I think that's probably enough.
I grew up in Pennsylvania, northeastern Pennsylvania, listening to stories that my grandmother told about her growing up in what she called the old country. It was the Slovak corner of Austria-Hungary. She was actually born in Colorado, and after the death of her mother, her father took her and her sisters and young baby's brother back to the old country where they had land and a support network of family. And so she grew up there, and the stories about that time, that pre-war time, in the Slovak of that village were all pervasive in my childhood, often translated through my mother, who was always there with us. And she spoke also about her husband, who died about a decade before I was born. So I never knew the man, my grandfather, who apparently was quite a man. He fought as a young Slovak conscript in the Austrian Landwehr. He was that young, and I'm that old enough to have had a grandfather who fought in the First World War. And that was another part of it. I know that he fought on the Piave River. He likely surrendered quickly when he could see that it was that the English had helped the Italians to finish the war, and was sent to Sardinia as a prisoner of war, where he was actually, as he used to say, was lucky to have been imprisoned by the Italians, and then walked home to this new country of Czechoslovakia and got on a boat that spring and came to the U.S. And he and my grandmother, strangely enough, they never went back, they never looked back, they never wrote a letter back. But my grandmother would constantly tell these stories, I suspect perhaps as an unburdening. And so when I had begun writing as in the genre of nonfiction, and I imagined this sort of nonfiction cold mountain, as it were. And when I pitched it, I was told that I could never do that. And I had already done a great deal of research. I was living in London at the time, and going to these places geographically where the war had happened and where I knew he had set foot. And so, but I was told that maybe I should write a novel. And rather than having this sprawling epic, I just began to imagine this voice of my grandfather, and I took all of the stories, the sort of those points of conflict in each of these stories, and just made a sort of amalgam of one character. And through many fits and starts, settled into the singular voice and the very pared down novel, which it became, which The Sojourn became. And so there it is.
Hi, I really hate talking about myself, but I'm gonna try. The idea from this book came from a kind of a funny thing about me, which is that I eat a lot. I must have a high metabolism or something. When I go to a new place, I'm usually, the first thing is I'm like, where am I going to get food? And Mark and Kathleen back there can tell you that they've actually witnessed me doing that in Dayton. And so when long story short, I was a journalist in New York City, and met and married a guy, it's all in the book. And we ended up moving to Baghdad to cover the war. That was his job. And so my first thought when I got to Baghdad was like, okay, this is all very interesting, and I'm gonna write stories about stuff and politics, and that's what I write about. But I gotta know, where's the market, where's the grocery store, where's the restaurant, and so that was sort of the way I dealt with Baghdad as a person, not as a journalist. And as a journalist, I was writing this sort of political, analytical coverage, and this bombing and that bombing, and this political movement and all that. And that stuff is interesting, but to me, and I think to most of my friends, when I would come home, or when I would sort of meet other people who hadn't been to Baghdad, the first thing, no one ever asked me, what is Muqtada Sadr really like, or what do you think about the governing council and the CPA and all that. They would say, well, what does it look like, and what do people talk about, and everyone was really interested if you'd been in the house of somebody who was a lifelong Baghdadi. Well, what are their houses like? What do they eat? What is dinner like? And so a couple of years later, kind of took time to sort of think about it. It occurred to me, wow, well, if I was going to read a book about the Iraq War, there's plenty of books about the politics, there's plenty of books about the military, but there weren't that many books about what is ordinary civilian life, what is that like before, after, and during a war. We have a lot of books about war, and we tend to know a lot more about societies at war than we know about those societies before the war, which I think is crazy. It's kind of like trying to understand, I don't know, it doesn't make sense. You can't understand a society without understanding what it was like before it got disrupted. So the idea for Day of Honey was that I would use food as a way of talking about civilian life and how people organize their lives. I mean, we hate to admit it, but we all do tend to sort of organize our lives around food. The average person makes, what is it, like something like 260 decisions every day about food and what to eat and when to eat it. That's an actual number. Brian Munsink, sort of food socio-behavioral psychologist, actually determined this. And when you're in a war zone, this is one of the things that becomes very difficult. Many things become very difficult. Giving birth, for example, when you can't get to a hospital. Many women die because they can't get to a hospital as a result of a war. And war casualty numbers often include people who die of things like tainted food or water. World War I, many people died of Spanish influenza as a result of, direct result of the war. And so you don't count those because they're not combat casualties, but this disruption of everyday life is one of the worst and most soul-crushing things about a war. And so I thought it would be interesting to write about that, and that is what my book is about, and that and food and those recipes.
Hi, I'm Tim O'Brien. First I want to say thank you to Sharon and the whole committee. What a great honor. I've lived my whole life being called a war writer, and as I kind of lost it last night and teared up. But what a refreshing and wonderful change to win a peace award, for I feel as if that's been my life's work, sort of holding back the glacier and losing the battle, but trying. I just have a few random thoughts, and I'll pass the microphone. I had wanted to be a writer from the time I was a little boy of 7 or 8 years old, and had written baseball stories and little mysteries happening in my hometown where nothing interesting ever did happen, but I made it happen, which is one of the things about fiction, is that I learned as a young kid that you don't have to just write about what happens in the world, but you can also write about what didn't happen, or almost happened, or could have happened. And that principle I've applied now since the time I was 8 years old. I do write fiction. My stories are invented. They're launched out of a real world of experience, but I rapidly move in my work into an imagined world. As an example, my dad died not too long ago, and in the final hours of his life, as he lay dying in a hospital bed in San Antonio, I could have and I should have taken my dad in my arms, and I could have and I should have said what you would say, Dad, I love you. And for a whole amalgam of reasons having to do with the Midwest and fathers and sons and how difficult it is in language to articulate things like love, I stayed silent. But in a story, miracles can happen. In a story, my dad can sit up from the dead. And he can say, that's okay. I know you love me. Didn't happen, can't happen, but it moves me more than the literal truth of things. Something happens to my heart with those unspoken words that are spoken in a story. That's okay, I know you love me. This desire to be a writer, to make things up and imagine worlds carried over into Vietnam. The desire to write collided with being drafted and going to this war. And I began seriously writing in Vietnam. After a day's march, most of the guys would horse around and tell stories as dark came on. We were sitting at our foxholes. And I would now and then write little 1 or 2 or 3 page vignettes about what had happened that day or some earlier time. And I would stash them in my rucksack, and I came home with probably 30 or 40 handwritten pages. This was not literature, this was confession and blurting out. It was testimony, that sort of thing, recollection, which I then spent a couple of years trying to form as best I could. I was young, my first book is not that good. That's the single virtue of honesty, and that's about it. And I learned through the writing of that book the making of sentences, as I said last night, and will repeat now, is really my life's work. As much as we end up at these things talking about big stuff, my daily routine is to sit in front of a computer and make sentences and try to make graceful, decent ones that I haven't, read in some, classic I almost finished back in college or a bestseller I picked up last week. To make sentences that are carry a certain grace. And that's how I spend my days.
Some of you will recognize me from last year. I don't know why Sharon put me up here other than to lend support to Tim in case he lost it like he did last time. But for the benefit of the curious, I was born in 1942, like Adam, and I unfortunately happened to spend 44 years of my life in prison, and over a quarter of a century of that time, I became a writer. I was a journalist, and I practiced my craft behind bars, and then I went on to become a radio correspondent, television, and later filmmaker. I got out when a jury in a fourth trial freed me in 2005, and I, got out without a dime to my name, so, pretty hostile place out here. You can't, it's difficult to get a job when you're an ex-con, so I wrote a book. And the place of justice, and that's it.
So thank you, everyone, and thank you for being here. I want to briefly, and very briefly, thank Sharon and Mark and everyone for letting me be part of this wonderful event. It's striking to me that it's actually Veterans Day, or as it originally was called, Armistice Day, and that we have two prize winners that wrote a book about World War I that seems rather fitting that we're here to, in a way, celebrate the peace that came finally and briefly, I guess, in 1917, I guess, was there 18, 17, 18. In any case, it's hard to, we have only a few minutes, so it's hard to get as specific as I would like with each of these wonderful writers, because I have lots of questions I would have asked, but I'm going to try to ask a general question that maybe each of you can shape toward your work. And that general question is, you've touched on it, some of you already, whether you set out, when you sat down that first day, as Tim said, staring at the paper and writing sentence by sentence, to write a book that you thought might change views about peace, or at least expressing the absurdity of war or the horrors of it, or was your story and the book you had in mind coming first with that as kind of a moral attachment? And there are some specific questions that go with that too, which is, how difficult was it to do what Tim said with that large theme in mind? And I think I would start that with Adam and ask you, because I was very curious as you answered that, whether you knew who the characters in your book were, and because your book is so wonderful as a narrative as well as a history, whether you knew who the characters were, and whether you sort of knew how you were going to structure the book, or whether that came out of your research as you went.
Well, I knew that I wanted to write a book about the First World War, the horror of it, the madness of it, and the bravery of the people, some of whom I had read about and known about and just encountered in my reading, who resisted that madness. They were unsuccessful, but in a way, it felt a challenge to me. Can I write a book? My previous book, as I mentioned, was about the anti-slavery movement in the British Empire, which did, at least on paper, eventually end slavery almost everywhere on earth. Could I write as exciting a story about a movement that failed? So that was a challenge that I set out with. Finding the characters was a major part of it, because I like to write history through choosing a group of people who lived through a period of time, a period of political and moral struggle, and people whose lives connect with each other in one way or another, because that's what draws us through a film, a TV series, a novel. You know, we're not just reading, you know, sort of isolated portraits of one person after another. We're reading about a web of characters. That's how we live our lives, connected to a web of friends, enemies, lovers, family, relatives, and so on. Well, assembling the cast was difficult because I had these two very disparate types of people I was interested in. The war resistors and these boneheaded generals who orchestrated the whole war. And I couldn't figure out how to get them into the same book. I knew that I didn't want to do sort of alternating chapters about one type and the other type, or a series of portraits. For the longest time, I couldn't figure out how to do it. I did nothing but read about the First World War for about a year and a half. And I'd already, earlier in my life, done a lot of reading about this period. Then one day, it suddenly came to me, very quickly. I was reading a very boringly written scholarly article, the sort of place where I often get my best ideas. Boringly, you know, where a scholar has delved deep into some subject but doesn't realize the kind of human gold that he or she has found. And it was a biographical piece about a well-known British woman pacifist named Charlotte Despard, who wrote the best-selling anti-war pamphlet published in Britain during the First World War, traveled up and down the country, speaking to large gatherings, which were frequently broken up by patriotic mobs or shut down by Scotland Yard, visited the families of conscientious objectors, tried to keep their spirits up. She herself was a radical in every cause of the day, favored independence for India, had been to jail 4 times in the battle for women's suffrage in Britain just before the war. And in one sentence, in passing, this professor who was writing this piece, just one sentence, said, naturally, Mrs. Despard's activities were deeply upsetting to her brother. And it gave his name, Sir John French, which I recognized as Commander-in-Chief on the Western Front. So I thought, this is going to be an interesting relationship to explore. And indeed it was, because this brother and sister were not only had diametrically opposed politics, but they were quite fond of each other. They continued to see each other throughout the war. They stopped speaking to each other only when, at the end of the war, the British government, which was trying to suppress a nationalist revolt in Ireland, sent him to Ireland to do that as Viceroy of Ireland. She went to Ireland to work for the IRA. They stopped speaking and never saw each other again after that. But then that immediately gave me the idea, I think it hit about a day or two later, divided families. That's how I'm going to tell this story. So then I changed the specifications for my casting call, so to speak, to include divided families, and I found several others, and really it's characters from 3 divided families or family groups that form the core of the book.
Great, thank you. And Andrew, I'm going to ask you a similar question about whether you set out to write a book more about peace or about your family, or both. And specifically in your case, I'm very curious how you were able to retrace a story that probably wasn't written up in history books before, and how you were able to find a cousin, for example, of your grandfather and figure out what their relationship was. How much of that did you invent, and how much did you really discover?
So a couple things. First of all, it's most of the things that seem crazy are true. That if you've read the book, the opening, prologue, for lack of a better word, although it's just a prelude, is true. My grandmother's mother was killed on a train trestle in Pueblo, Colorado, and she threw her 4-month-old baby into the water, who was rescued by a boy named Roy Palmer, who fished him out of the water, and the railroad company gave my great-grandfather $50, and he went back to Austria-Hungary. But so I had that story. I knew of that story. I knew that I suspected my grandfather probably surrendered quite quickly. My mother said he had his only injury was to his ring finger on his right hand, and I could just imagine. And I have a photograph of him with 3 other gunnery mates, and my cousin, my wife's cousin in England is a colonel in the British Army, and I showed him this photograph, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's a machine gun retrofitted to be an anti-aircraft gun because the Sopwith camels of the British were wreaking havoc on the Austrian lines on the Piave River." And so, you know, it was clear to me that he just surrendered quickly. And so this idea of giving over, of a surrendering in a sense, is really began as a theme for my book. So in that sense, I did set out to write a novel about surrendering. And then, as I said, I said last night that I've been sort of haunted by the ghost of my grandfather. And so I wanted to write a sort of fictional coming of age. I didn't really, write a war novel. He fought in a war, and I knew that he fought in a war and he walked home from it, and so that also was a piece of it. The other things were a function of narrative problem solving, of being at the desk and thinking, how do I get from, not always from point A to point B, but then there's a point C that follows point B. The introduction of the character Zli Pes was both a bet with my mother and some help from her through letters before she passed away. So I took my mother and my father to the village where my grandparents grew up because I'd been there many times to visit and see family. And I always wanted to know why no one came back. And so I took my parents when they were in their 70s. And the trip itself was epic and maybe should be another book. But there was a sign on a door in Prague that said "Pozor Zli Pes," which is beware of the dog, the mad dog. And this idea of Zli Pes, I said to my mother, what a great name for a character in a novel. And she said, well, there, see if you can do it. And so Zli Pes was introduced later when I actually showed my mother in her old age home from the manuscript, and I wanted to dedicate it to her because without her intervention or without her own translation, none of the stories would have come down to me. And she wrote me a letter saying that the book needed more passion, and she suggested that there might have been this strange cousin who was involved in the scene somewhere, and she gave me some dates and some possibilities which didn't fit in some ways, but fit in other ways, and so then I had to go back and reconnect it. Also, the fact that the two of them go off to become sharpshooters in the army was a function of reading Siegfried Sassoon's memoir of an infantry officer, where his lance corporal was killed by a sniper when he just pokes his head up over a trench just before they're about to do a midnight raid. And Sassoon is very phlegmatic in his explanation of it and his telling of it. But it was that moment where I realized how I knew I had to get my main character to the Piave River, but I was interested, as I said last night, more in a kind of formation of these men. And it was that moment where I thought, of course, this particular vocation of what the Germans called the Scharfschützen was what they had to be, because those type of men were sojourners in themselves and private, separate from the other ranks, doing a particular job that was specific to both sides. But on the southern front, the Italians feared what they called the Cecchini, the Czechs with the rifles, essentially. And so, again, one of the best things my long ago editor said to me was, everyone has a subject. The question is, what's the story? And so I've had to think both of, I had to fit it all into the arc of a narrative.
Great, thanks. So Anya, you're next, and again, I'm going to ask you some of that process, but in your case, something that really struck me about your wonderful book was, at the end, you point out that in a way you missed going through all the hell of this combat zone, or 2 combat zones that you lived in, and that in a way life seemed less interesting without it. I'm curious whether you still feel that way, and as you were writing the book, whether it brought back the real horror mixed with incredible humor, as you did, and also I'm just curious whether you still feel that way, that you want to go back, and whether this might, even one more point, does the feeling of people who come back from war, veterans, does that relate to that same feeling that you felt as a writer?
That's a really, wow, that's a lot.
Well, whatever part of that you want to answer.
It's a really good question. I can't claim to know what veterans experience, so I can't speak to that, although I do know that the people that who seem to understand, that my husband and I in particular seem to gravitate toward people who have, who have been in war zones and have experienced them. And by the way, when I say war zones, I lived in Buffalo in the mid-1990s, and let me tell you, that was up there with Baghdad during the war. I'm not joking. I am not joking. It's a very dangerous, very nasty place. And so there's all kinds of war zones. And there are times of economic hardship that, America can be a scary place too. People, when they do studies of trauma, they find that kids in dangerous neighborhoods and not just inner city neighborhoods, we have this misconception, rural areas can be dangerous as well, often have levels of trauma that are approaching those of people who have lived in war zones and been in war zones. So that's important to remember, I guess. There is something, people ask me that a lot, and there is something that sounds really decadent about that, or like, oh, I miss the adrenaline of combat. And it's not necessarily that you miss it, it's that you feel that it is there, just waiting to poke its head back up above the surface. And so you're always constantly a little bit on edge. You always kind of look around. New York, where I live now, and I always kind of say, like when the hurricane happened and the electricity went out, how many days until people start fighting each other? And that, it's not rational, it's a completely irrational response, but you always feel that stuff is there. And you also feel this sense that you don't want to forget what you've seen and what has happened. And maybe writing a book is part of that. Maybe when you have experienced something that you don't really understand, part of how you deal with it is to write a book about it. It helps you to articulate things that you maybe still don't really understand. So for me, writing Day of Honey was very much a way of trying to do that, trying to understand that, what I had experienced. And I wouldn't say that I miss that experience, but I do think that it's really important to remember that wars are happening. We are much more comfortable talking about wars of the last century than we are about the wars that are happening now. The Iraq War is still going on. We're just now beginning to talk about Vietnam. It's going to be a while before we really understand what happened, what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are wars that are still very much happening. Just because we left doesn't mean it's not happening. And we didn't leave entirely, by the way, it's important to remember. And so it seems really important to remember as we go about our peaceful lives and promoting peace and trying to be peaceful in every way, that there is this war going on, even as we speak. There could be a suicide bombing happening in Iraq right now, I wouldn't be surprised. And to forget that is to allow it to keep happening. And I, for that reason, I think that it's important for us to keep talking about these things, to keep remembering them, not to flip past and say, oh God, another one, which is everyone's normal impulse, even mine. And I'm horrified to say that. I still have friends in Baghdad, but you become so inured to it, you become so desensitized. And part of the problem is the way that we tell the story. We focus on wars, and we tell the story of war the same way over and over and over again. And right now, I guess I'm talking primarily about journalism, but I think that war stories do have this tendency to sort of cycle back. The journalist Martha Gellhorn called war a horrible repetition. Wars have a lot in common. It's really interesting when you see things happening that have happened before. And yet they happen again. And there are always these people, like in World War I, who stick their heads up and say, hey, wait a minute, last time this happened, it was bad, maybe we should remember that. This happened here in America in 2003. There were plenty of people saying, hey, maybe this isn't such a great idea. Again, it happens regardless of those people, but it's important to remember that there are those people. And it's important to remember that this horrible repetition goes on, and that we can do something to stop it in our small ways. So for that reason, I guess that's why I keep talking about it and boring my friends and ruining dinner parties by talking about the wrong word.
Thank you. Certainly not boring anybody. Tim, again, an honor to have you here. And You answered some of the questions I've asked in your remarks last night and earlier today, but I'm curious, something else you touched on, how veterans in general have dealt with your books, especially, as you say, when you're dealing with the peace aspects of them. You told a wonderful story last night, which you might want to mention again, about a combat veteran who thought you had written a book about the glory of wars rather than not. But I assume that's not the usual reaction, and I'd love to hear a little bit about what is.
The reactions from, especially from returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan has been astonishing. The similarities, the things that we went through, guerrilla war, who's your enemy, whom do you kill, landmines blowing you up, they're now called IEDs, how do you shoot back at them? They're dead, you can't shoot back at them. The consequences of frustration, bitterness, as day after day men are dying and being badly wounded around you, and yet there's no enemy in the old-fashioned World War I or World War II sense or Civil War sense of there's the enemy, let's have it out. The civilian casualties all around us in Vietnam, 3 million dead Vietnamese, almost never mentioned. When veterans talk about their wars, it's always me, me, me. A kind of mixture of nostalgia 40 years ago with a kind of self-sacrificial pride of service, forgetting the nastiness of it all. It's all buried beneath the flags and the rhetoric. Adam had mentioned earlier his focus on moral struggle, and I too have the same focus in my work, the points of moral decision that are come to us in times of war, but also in our families. Should I stay married to that man, or should I, whom should I marry in my life? Or all the decisions we make, they're moral struggles. In my own case, I was drafted to fight in a war when I was fresh out of college, a war I despised. It seemed to me the best you could say about Vietnam was that certain blood was being shed for uncertain reasons, which is to say the bodies were for sure, they were dead. And the orphans were for sure, and the widows. Nobody disputed it, the mutilated. But the reasons for the war were in great dispute, as anyone who lived through that era knows. I mean, hawks at the throats of doves all across our country, in the halls of Congress, families divided. And it seemed to me then, as a young guy carrying around a draft notice in his pocket, that you don't go kill people unless you're pretty sure it's the right thing to do. I mean, kind of sure. And yet we were. There was no sense of consensus behind the war. So I ended up finally going to a war after a terrible moral struggle, lying in my bed in Worthington, Minnesota, and should I go fight in a war I despise? And one part of me would say, you should do it, your country's asked you to. The other part of my head would be saying, that what about your own conscience? And more than Vietnam itself, it was just before going to the war, the struggle over what do you kill for and what do you die for, if anything. And you're doing this with imperfect information. I didn't have CIA reports coming in. I didn't have access to what our presidents were hearing or the people in Congress. I was a kid making what I thought was a permanent decision, and it was one. Having said that, I guess what I'm trying to say in general is that I don't think of myself as a war writer any more than Joseph Conrad would think of himself as an ocean writer, or Shakespeare, a king writer, or Toni Morrison, a black writer. I mean, there are these pigeonholes that it's about the human heart and moral struggle, as Adam said. And that, I think, is my focus as I'm writing my books.
Great, thank you. And Wilbert, finally, pass this on to you. You've had an amazing experience to write about, and I'm fascinated to hear that you taught yourself to write or perfected your craft in prison. And I'm just curious about how you, I want you to say anything you want to say, but I'm curious how you were able to translate that into writing a book and coming back into society and getting that accepted, and whether you felt bitter and if that got in the way. Anything you want to say about that would be great.
Well, I spent 12 and a half years in a place about the size of the typical bathroom, 6 by 8 foot cell. And I got out of it 15 minutes twice a week for a shower. And the worst company you're ever going to ask for in life is your own. You know, you don't have the usual social and psychological crutches and all that to hold you up and to keep you sane. So I read. And at first it was reading, because back then the only material that let you read a religious literature. Everything else was banned, but there's always an active black market going, so I started reading, and I just kept reading. And finally, at some point, I was just appalled by my own experience, and you know, and all these people out here talking about, we don't understand this, we don't understand crime, we don't understand prison, we don't understand, and you know, I understood it, you know, so I figured, you know, maybe I can make a contribution, do something, and you know, so I figured, you know, I can write. I mean, you know, people aren't born writing. They don't come into the world with pens and typewriters in their hands. So if, you know, they can learn it, I can learn it. So I started reading for a different purpose, and that was to figure out how to use the words and how they strung them together. And in that fashion, I learned how to write. And so when I got out of that situation, I ended up in the jungle of what we call prison population, in the biggest maximum security prison in the country, and it was also the bloodiest. I was appalled at what was happening, and I realized then that, you know, the world really doesn't know what the hell the reality of all this is. I mean, whether you're talking about crime, whether you're talking about prison, whether you're talking about violence, most people think they know based on the movies that shape their perception, that shapes popular perception, but most of the criminals and most of the things you see about prison, crime, and violence, when you're looking at it through the movies, you're looking at these series, they're mostly, especially the criminals, a lot of them are figments of some director's imagination. And a lot of them don't exist in real life, just like a lot of the things in prison don't exist in real life. So that's why I started writing. You know, I'm going to change this. I'm going to tell the world about it. And I happen to be exceptionally fortunate in that I ran into a guy who took over the system, C. Paul Phelps, who was he wasn't the traditional warden. And he was willing, with a handshake, to give me freedom from censorship, which was unprecedented in American history. No prison had ever operated without censorship. And they still don't today. So you only know what they want you to know. And you only see what they let you see. And when you see a camera, it's controlled. I know a lot of people look at these shows on TV, Lockup and all this other stuff on cable. Those cameras are controlled. You only see what they want you to see. And so I had this little different situation. And that's the reason I was able to write and do all the things I did. And, well, the one thing I did publish, you know, I was published in magazines. I was published, in fact, your company, Random House, published me in 1992. And the thing is, but the publishers always wanted my life story. They wanted my memoir. But I was smart enough to realize, because I'd heard all these guys who came back to prison, what it's like, you know, when you're free. And so I figured that the smartest move I made was not to do my memoir, because I knew that, you know, if these guys are right, I'm gonna have a hard time when I get out. I'm gonna need a nest egg of some kind, because in prison they pay you 2 cents an hour, and when they release you, it's not with a retirement package. They give you $10 and a bus ticket, and that's it. That's the reason a lot of guys go back to prison. But so I just hung on to that, and when I got out, I realized, hey, they were telling the truth. You know, nobody wants to hire you, nobody wants to do anything. Well, okay, here goes the book. So I wrote the memoir, and I was, again, fortunate in that I didn't have any problem getting a publisher. In fact, they lined up, and because as I pointed out last night, they didn't, you know, it didn't make it a bestseller, to which, you know, my publisher regrets, I'm sure, because they ran in a situation where, you know, they thought it would be a bestseller, but they didn't count on the fact that the climate had changed in America, and that we ran into a problem that you had book dealers who they wouldn't even carry the book. I guess some of them presupposed that I was then what I was 50 years before, and, you know, can never be anything different. And, you know, we were dealing with prejudice, and so, you know, some people, hey, he's a criminal. We don't care what he has to say. So, you know, if they're not going to carry your book, you're not going to sell it. And, you know, I guess my publisher regrets that. I do too. But, you know, that's life. And that's not a complaint. That's just life. I have a good life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you. We might have, Shannon, I don't know, if we may have a minute or two for questions for the audience. Our time is almost up. Is that okay? Can we take one or two? So if anybody has a question for anybody here, yes, you, sir. There.
I've taught literature for many years, and there are only two works that I remember generating in the classroom this kind of group therapy. One of them was The Things They Carry, and the other one, believe it or not, was Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night. And I think if I were still teaching college, I would use a semester with both of those books, because they both deal with conflicts and wars of one kind or another. And I think what is amazing about what you've done today is you've all implied that connection, that we can't just pigeonhole war as something out there and what goes on in our lives as entirely different. So I want to thank you all for that presentation. I think it was wonderful.
Great. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? Yes, you back there.
My question is...
Well, you go first, and since you started, and then we'll go to you.
Okay, my question is for Adam, and I've read your book and enjoyed it very much. The latter half of World War I, we had the influenza pandemic, which was probably the worst pandemic since the plagues of the 1600s, 1400s, that period. But then it evaporated from our collective knowledge for another 60 or 70 years. In your research, was there any indication as to why that happened?
Well, I'm not a scientist, so I can't really tell you why the influenza pandemic happened, because pandemics like that do recur throughout history. This was a particularly virulent strain of influenza, but I think it made a huge difference that it happened while a war was on, because you know, a disease like that spreads. There was one peculiar thing about that variety of influenza, the one that hit in 1918, was that the most vulnerable people were the young and healthy, people who were healthy in their 20s and 30s. Because of the way this particular type of flu operated, it caused people who had it to quickly manufacture fluid in their own lungs and the body's, you know, misbegotten attempt to stamp out this external virus, and people essentially drowned from internal fluid. The death rate was highest among those in their 20s and 30s. What were men in their 20s and 30s doing between, you know, in 1970, 1918, 1919? they were serving in the military throughout Europe, throughout the United States. The first case of that influenza strain that came to medical attention occurred in an army camp in Kansas. American troops rapidly carried it to Europe because there were something like 2.2 million American troops transported to Europe in 1918. And you can just follow the flu spreading across Europe from the port of Brest in France, where most of those troops landed. And of course, anything like that spreads most rapidly when the vulnerable population, which in this case was people in their 20s and 30s, are in very close confinement. Troop ships, packed railway cars, army barracks, trenches, and prisons. A lot of the war resistors, there were 6,000 war resistors locked up in British prisons. A lot of them got the influenza as well. So in that way, it was sort of fatally interwoven with the war. I think it took the death toll it did among the civilian population because particularly in Germany and Austria-Hungary, that was a population that was very weakened by lack of nourishment, lack of food, and then it spread around the world from there. I cannot imagine that pandemic, which ultimately they estimate today took maybe 50 million lives, I cannot imagine it being as severe and spreading so quickly were it not for the war that was going on at that time.
Great, thanks. You had your hand up, so we'll call on you. Maybe there's time for one more after, or maybe not. We'll see.
This is just a question for Anya. If anyone else would like to chime in, they're welcome to. But I was wondering, when you were writing, I'm sure purposes of books like yours don't really come about right away, especially when you're on the ground and you don't know how you're going to look back on things. But was one of the considerations going back to Beirut, did it come from a desire to make humanity sort of break down this wall between us and them for a Middle Eastern idea, or was it more just to report on, more of a factual reporting on the side of how people are going day to day in a war, just because this one hasn't been talked about yet?
That's a really good question. I think, can you all hear me?
That's a really good question. I think it was both. There was a desire to talk about day-to-day life because I knew that that's what most people were interested in, but also that is something that people could relate to. Politics, war, even combat become abstractions unless you have experienced them, and sometimes even if you have. Whereas there is something so concrete about dinner, you know? It is right there in front of you, and it struck me as a way that people could relate to other human beings on this very, very simple human level. There is something about eating, breaking bread with other people. You do have to see them as human beings, at least for the duration of that meal. I actually don't think that breaking bread can lead to world peace, unfortunately. We have too many contrary examples. But you do have to see people as humans while they're eating. It's simply too concrete, too human, too basic of an action. And so it was very much this desire to show that. And also something, it's funny, people often describe my book as apolitical. And I always think, wow, like, I don't think of it that way. I think that describing people as human beings is the most political thing you could possibly do. And particularly people in the Middle East, but people in any war zone, in any other country, in any context that has become politicized and that has become suffused with ideology. Simply describing, hey, these are people who sit down and make rice and stew, and that to me seems like the most political thing ever. And so I was thinking about it that way. But I originally actually thought of it as that it would be this sort of like lovely kind of Guerre in Provence type book. And that was sort of what I set out to write, and it didn't end up being that way. It was more like Guerre in Provence, but with war. and so I guess this is all. You always have these sort of good intentions that you'll write something that is, I guess, palatable. No pun intended. But I'm happy with how it turned out. I think had I tried to write a book that didn't address the darker side of life, it wouldn't have made sense. I heard a quote once from a high school teacher who was discussing. She was teaching in a high school where the sex scene had been cut from Romeo and Juliet. And we all know there's a sex scene. It's not quite explicit, but you know, it's referred to. And she said there's something really obscene about that, because if you cut that, then it's only about death. And telling a war story where you leave out the war would be as obscene as telling a war story where you only talk about war. And so I was glad that I had that sort of yin and yang in there. But it was definitely my intention just to write about the human aspect of things, if that answers your question.
Great. I'm told we have time for one more question if anybody has one. Yes, there's a hand back there. We can try to get you a mic. Thank you.
It's not really a question, it's more of a comment for you, Andrew, and that is, I tend to be a very auditory person, and so as I began reading your book, I really enjoyed the cadence and the rhythm of the words. But I also, from the very beginning, found the description really incredible. And you know, I could see the gritty cabin in Colorado. And I just want to suggest that you pitch this as a screenplay, because I see it playing out as a good movie.
I hadn't intended that at all, but you're not the first to say that, but other people have said it would never happen because there are too many different languages in there, and that the historical movies are the hardest to make. But let me just say this about speaking, was that I did imagine, last night I mentioned the fact that in other drafts of the book there had been two grandsons of the older Joseph Vinich listening to the story. Then there was one grandson because it's 1972 and the other one was in Vietnam. And then I just, for some reason, I couldn't find, I didn't know why that grandson was there. My wife said to me, why does he have to be? Why can't he just be speaking the story to the reader? And so they all disappeared, except for that voice. And it's meant, if you were to sit down at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, or 6 o'clock or so, probably 6 o'clock, I wanted, and you just read the story, you should be done by about midnight. So in that sort of performative aspect of the story, I had that in mind, with respect to the talking and the telling. So thank you for that.
And thanks all of you. It's been a thrill for me to have a chance to talk to all of you, all of whom I admire and have admired. So thanks again.
Thank you. Yeah, let's give them all a round of applause. Now, I do want to let you guys know that the authors will be here to sign their books for you to purchase, and so we encourage you to do that. And I'm also being told that Tim O'Brien will be a little bit further down the hall, at a table down the hall, if you would like to speak with him and purchase his book and get his signature as well. Now, if you are not attending tonight's celebration, the inductions as well as the acceptance speeches will be available on the Dayton Literary Peace website later on. I'm not sure when, but it will be on there later on. And WYSO will also broadcast the speeches. I know that a 1 hour special of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize will be on New Year's Day. So we thank you all for coming, and we hope that you have enjoyed this morning.
Hi, Jeff.